The ferry moved slowly across the gray water. I stood at the railing and watched the mainland shrink behind me. It was late afternoon in October. The sky was the color of old silver. The wind carried salt and cold and the smell of somewhere far away. I was 22 years old, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The past year had carved grooves into me that I couldn't see, but could feel every time I tried to smile or laugh or pretend that things were fine. Work had become a fog. Relationships had become echoes. My own life felt like a movie I was watching from the back row of an empty theater. You know that feeling, when everything happening to you feels like it's happening to someone else. I won't go into the details of what came before. Let's just say I had made choices. Some of them were good, some of them were not. And by that point in my life, I was trying very hard to put distance between myself and certain chapters that I hoped were finished. What I needed was to disappear, just for a few days. I must have been talking about it at work, venting out loud while I sorted files or stared at my computer screen, because one day a coworker pulled me aside and told me about a place. A tiny island off the coast of Maine. He described it like this: aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark. Most people took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. If you stayed overnight, he said, it was like having the whole island to yourself. That was exactly what I was looking for. That night, I found a vacation rental listing online. A standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The photos showed a small wooden building with a single window facing the ocean. The interior was simple: a bed, a kitchenette that looked unused, a bathroom the size of a closet. It was clean and it was quiet. I set down my bag and stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, just listening. The walls were thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush outside like it was right next to my ear. The sound was soft and rhythmic, a constant whisper that seemed to breathe with the island itself. I checked the door. It had a deadbolt and a chain lock. Both looked like they'd been installed recently. The metal was shiny and new, without the rust or wear I would have expected in a place like this. I thought it was odd for such an isolated spot, but I didn't dwell on it. I spent the early evening walking the island. The path from the cottage led to a narrow road that curved along the shoreline. I passed a few houses with dark windows, a small general store that was already closed, a pub near the ferry landing with warm light spilling out onto the wooden deck. The day visitors were filtering back toward the dock. I watched them board the last ferry of the evening, their voices carrying across the water in fragments of conversation, a woman laughing, a child asking for ice cream, a man complaining about the cold. And then the boat pulled away, and the island was empty. It was surreal watching the place empty out like that. By the time the sun went down, there were no streetlights, no ambient noise, no signs of life except the occasional light in a distant window. I stood on the shoreline and listened to the ocean. The waves were gentle, small and rhythmic, pulling at the gravel beach with a sound like breathing. The sky darkened slowly, shifting from gray to deep blue to black. Stars appeared one by one, scattered across the darkness like someone had thrown salt across a table. It was beautiful. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. I grabbed dinner at the pub near the ferry landing. The place was small and warm, with wooden tables and a long bar, and the kind of quiet that comes from being the only customer. The bartender was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back and eyes that seemed to look right through me. She brought me a bowl of chowder and a glass of water and asked if I was staying on the island. I told her yes, just for a few nights. She nodded and started to turn away. Then she stopped. "Where are you staying?" she asked. I told her the name of the cottage. Her face changed, just slightly, just for a moment, a flicker of something I couldn't read. Then she smiled and said it was a nice spot and walked back to the bar. But I had seen that look. I had seen it before. On the walk back to the cottage, I passed a small dock tucked into a cove. It was about 100 yards from where I was staying. The dock was old and weathered, extending maybe 20 feet into the water. A single boat was moored there, a small motorboat with a blue hull. It stood out. All the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger, lobster vessels with heavy equipment and working decks. This one was small and sleek, the kind of boat you'd use for quick trips rather than serious fishing. I made a mental note of it, but I didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30. The wind had picked up slightly, moving through the brush with a sound like whispering. I locked the deadbolt. I slid the chain into place. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of the isolation settle around me like a blanket. Then I settled in for the night. I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone, intending to check messages before I slept, but when I plugged it into the charger, nothing happened. I tried a different outlet. Nothing. I tried every outlet in the cottage. Nothing. My phone battery was at 15%. I watched it drop to 14 as I held it in my hand. I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. No one likes being completely cut off. I told myself it didn't matter. I was exhausted anyway. The exhaustion from the past few months had been building and building, and now in this quiet place, it finally had permission to crash over me. I could feel it in my bones, a heaviness that made every movement feel like wading through water. I turned off my phone to save the battery. I pulled back the quilt and lay down on the bed. The last thing I remember was the sound of the wind outside, brushing against the walls like fingertips. I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of sleep. There was no noise, no light, just a sudden awareness that I was awake, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. And then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside. They were close, right in front of my door, and whoever was out there was taking their time. I could tell because there was a long pause between each step, a deliberate, waiting pause, like someone testing the silence. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. It definitely wasn't an animal. The rhythm was wrong. The weight was wrong. These were human footsteps, slow and careful and intentional. I shifted in bed, just slightly, just the smallest movement. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It wasn't empty, it was full of presence, full of attention, full of someone standing perfectly still just outside my door, listening. I held my breath. The silence stretched on, long enough that I started to doubt myself, long enough that I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe my exhausted brain had turned a raccoon into something worse. I didn't want to move. I just stared at the ceiling in the same position, my body rigid, my heart beating so hard I was sure it could be heard through the walls. And then, the footsteps came back. This time, there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by. They were approaching, coming closer with each deliberate step. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Right
up to the entrance, and then stopping directly in front of the door.
My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The cottage was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of waves. But there was something else now, a presence just on the other side of the door. I could feel them out there, waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. I started to hope that whoever it was would just walk away, that they'd realize the cottage was occupied and leave, that this was all some kind of mistake. Then I saw light. A beam of white cut through the crack around the door, sweeping across the room for just a second before disappearing. They were shining a flashlight through the gap, trying to see inside. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The light clicked off, and then the door handle moved. It was a soft sound, metal shifting against metal, someone testing to see if the door was locked. I shut my eyes. Click. The handle returned to its original position. The deadbolt held. I thought that would be enough. I thought they'd realize the door was locked and move on. That's what any normal person would do. But a few seconds passed, and then they tried again. This time, they put more weight into it. The door frame creaked. The deadbolt strained against the strike plate. I could hear the pressure in the sound, the force of someone pushing hard against the door, testing its limits. Then came the banging. Bang, bang, bang. 3 hard impacts, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny cottage that I actually flinched with each one. The walls seemed to shake, the window rattled in its frame. But the bangs activated something in my brain. The threat became real, not just fear anymore, but danger, immediate, physical danger. And even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, without planning, I moved. I slid out of bed and dropped to the floor. On my hands and knees, I crawled toward the door while that person was still banging on it. I positioned myself behind the door, crouched low, my back against the wall. If they broke through, I would be hidden when they entered. I would have a chance. The banging stopped. I stayed perfectly still, trying not to breathe too loudly. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the wind. I could hear the small sounds of the cottage settling around me. And then, a voice. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock. It was a man's voice, low and calm and completely unfamiliar. I didn't recognize it at all. But he knew my name. He knew I was in there. He knew exactly who he was looking for. The footsteps moved away from the door. I tracked the sound as it passed along the side of the cottage, past the bathroom wall, past the window, continuing around to the back. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the building. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. He knew I could hear him, and he was letting me know that he wasn't going anywhere. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name in that stranger's voice was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life, because it meant this wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some drunk tourist looking for a place to sleep. This was personal. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long he circled the cottage. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time became meaningless in the darkness. I just sat there behind the door, listening to those slow footsteps moving around and around the building. Sometimes they would stop for long moments, and I would imagine him pressing his face against the window or trying to peer through the gaps in the walls. I had no idea what he was doing, and a part of me was screaming for him to just break down the door and get it over with already. The waiting was worse than anything else, the not knowing. The anticipation. Eventually, the footsteps receded.
They moved away from the cottage, heading in the direction of the dock. I listened as they grew fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then, from the direction of the cove, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. It sputtered once, twice, then caught and settled into a steady hum. I listened as it pulled away from the shore, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it faded completely into the distance across open water. He was gone. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I didn't close my eyes for a single second. I stayed crouched behind that door until my legs cramped and my back ached. Then I moved to the bed and sat against the headboard, watching the window, waiting for the first light of dawn. The darkness felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was full of possibility, full of spaces where someone could be hiding, waiting, watching. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me flinch. I just sat there and waited. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. I didn't even think about gathering my things. I just needed to see. I needed to know if any of it had been real. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were footprints everywhere, heavy boot prints circling the building multiple times, crossing back and forth, pausing at the window, at the door, at the corners. The pattern showed someone who had spent a long time walking around my cottage in the darkness. I followed the prints. They led in a straight line from the cottage towards the dock, across the gravel, through the brush, down to the water's edge. They ended right at the shoreline, where a boat would have been tied up. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the water. Then I went back inside, gathered my things, and walked to the ferry landing. The next day was a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, a tired-looking woman in a small office near the dock. She asked if I had enjoyed my stay. I said yes. I didn't tell her what had happened. What would have been the point? I boarded the ferry. I sat inside the cabin with my bag on my lap and watched the island shrink behind me. By the time I reached the mainland, I was in a strange headspace, not scared exactly, not relieved, just hollow, like something had been taken from me that I couldn't name. But here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. There were no fresh footprints leading from any of the other buildings, no path from the road. The prints started at the water and ended at the water. He came by boat, specifically to that cottage on that specific night, and he knew my name. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who had told me about the island in the first place. I pulled him aside after work and told him everything. The footsteps, the banging, the voice calling my name. He swore up and down that he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. His face went pale, his eyes got wide. He kept shaking his head and saying he was sorry, even though it wasn't his fault. But that left me with the question, how did they find me? I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details. Let's just say I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. There are people from certain chapters of my life who I hope never cross my path again. But this was different. How did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I booked and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have answers to any of those questions. And the worst part is, nothing has changed since then. I still work the same job, I still live in the same place, I still go through my days pretending that everything is normal. But I have no reason to believe things are over. No reason to believe that whoever was outside that cottage has given up. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints in the gravel, and I wonder if one day I'll look out my window and see them again.
That was last year. I've spent the months since trying to convince myself that it was a one-time thing, a random event, someone who happened to be on the island that night and decided to scare a stranger for no reason. But I don't believe that, not really. Because here's the thing about fear. It doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It settles into the background. It becomes part of the landscape of your life. You learn to function around it, but it's always there, waiting for the moment when something reminds you of what you're trying to forget. For me, that moment comes every night. Every time I hear footsteps outside my apartment, every time someone knocks on my door unexpectedly, every time I'm alone in the dark and my mind starts to wander. I see those boot prints in the gravel. I hear that voice saying my name, and I wonder when he'll come back. I've thought about moving, changing my name, disappearing the way I tried to disappear that weekend on the island. But where would I go? How would I know that whoever found me once couldn't find me again? Besides, there's a part of me that needs to know. Who was he? How did he know my name? What did he want? Maybe that's why I haven't left. Maybe that's why I still go to work every day and live in the same place and pretend that everything is normal. Because somewhere deep down, I'm waiting for him to come back. I'm waiting for answers, even if those answers terrify me. Last week, I got a letter, no return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of in a state I'd never visited. The handwriting was messy, almost illegible, like someone writing in a hurry or with an unsteady hand. Inside was a single sentence: "I know you're still there, Leo." That was all. I stared at those words for a long time, long enough for the sun to go down outside my window, long enough for the room to grow dark around me. Then I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't call the police. What would I tell them? That someone sent me a vaguely threatening note with no specific threat? That a year ago someone knocked on my door on an island off the coast of Maine? They wouldn't do anything. So I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the next thing, the next sign, the next reminder that I haven't been forgotten. And I'm starting to realize something. Whoever was outside that cottage, whoever sent that letter, they're not just trying to scare me. They're not just passing through. They're patient. They're methodical. They're letting me know that they're still there without giving anything away. They want me to wait. They want me to wonder. They want me to live with the fear until it becomes part of who I am. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the waiting is the punishment. I don't know how this ends. Maybe one night I'll hear those footsteps again, this time closer, this time inside. Maybe I'll finally get my answers. Maybe I won't. But I do know one thing. That weekend on the island changed me. Not in the way that people say after a scary experience. Oh, it made me appreciate life more, or I'm stronger now. No, it changed me in a deeper way. It showed me that the past isn't always past, that the things we try to leave behind can follow us, that no matter how far we run, there's always someone who knows where we are. I still work the same job. I still live in the same place. I still go through my days pretending that everything is normal. But at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I think about that island. I think about the footsteps on the gravel. I think about the voice that knew my name. And I wait. I wait for the next time, because I know it's coming. I just don't know when. The end.